بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. We start today the next statement in At-Tahaawiyyah's creed rahimahullah ta'ala, and the short statement is Wallahu yaghdabu wa yarda la ka ahadin min al-wara. Wallahu yaghdabu wa yarda la ka ahadin min al-wara. And this translates as, the meaning of this is that Allah becomes angry and becomes pleased, but not like any amongst the creation. Allah becomes angry and Allah becomes pleased and He becomes pleased, but not like anyone from the creation. So we'll start with the brief commentary of Sheikh Zayd al-Madkhali rahimahullah ta'ala. And so he says that here the author is simply indicating the affirmation of two of the attributes of Allah which befit His majesty and His greatness. One of them is the attribute of anger, and the other, which is al-ghadab, and the other is the attribute of ar-rida, which is pleasure. And these two attributes are from the attributes which are what we call sifatul af'al. Sifatul af'al, meaning that these are attributes which are really tied to His actions, and they do not resemble that which is found amongst the creation. So Allah's anger is not like the anger of the creation, and nor is His pleasure like the pleasure of the creation. And we see that Allah Azza wa Jal, He's described with anger. He becomes angry with the sinful people, with the criminals, and likewise He's described with sakhat, which is another type of anger and displeasure. And we find evidence for this in the Quran. Allah Azza wa Jal, He says in Surah Al-Mujadilah, غَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ غَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ. Allah is angry with them. And likewise, أَن سَخِطَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ, Surah Al-Ma'idah, that Allah, His sakhat, meaning His, again His anger. So we see here clearly evidence in the Quran that Allah becomes angry and becomes displeased. And as it relates to Allah Azza wa Jal, these two attributes are attributes of perfection. That Allah becomes angry, that Allah becomes displeased, and likewise the attribute of pleasure. All of these, as it relates to the attributes of Allah, we know all the attributes of Allah are completion and perfection. And this is different to the attribute of anger in the creation, because when it is not anger for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal, and when it is not pleasure for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal, then it is, obviously it's for something else. It is for the self or the soul or certain other motives and reasons. And this can be something which is harmful to the servant, and it can be something that he is, accountable for. So therefore it is not a perfection. His anger, His pleasure is not a perfection and a completion as it is with Allah Azza wa Jal. So as we said, as the Shaykh explained here, that al-ghadab is an attribute, is a sifatun fi'liyah. It is an attribute which is tied to Allah's action. In other words, that Allah becomes angry when He, according to His will, and Allah becomes pleased according to His will. There are things which please Him, there are things which anger Him. And so these type of attributes which are sifat fi'liyah, then we affirm them in a way that does not resemble that is not like that which is found in the creation, nor do we start distorting these attributes, nor do we start making explanations of them which are figurative or metaphorical, nor do we negate them outright. Rather, the principle that we follow in all of this is that principle in the Quran, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. And so this is the belief of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah in relation to these attributes. As for Sheikh Salih al-Sheikh, he has a lengthier treatment on this. And so he first of all says that the author here, Imam al-Tahaawi, rahimahullah ta'ala, may Allah reward him, hasten the reward for him, for the fact that he has made the creed of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah easy to understand by way of these simple, short statements. And so here he said, وَاللَّهُ يَغْضَبُ وَيَرْضَى لَا كَأَحَدٍ مِنَ الْوَرَى. Allah becomes angry and is pleased, but not like anyone from the creation. So here, the intent of Imam al-Tahaawi behind this statement is to affirm this category of attributes for Allah Azza wa Jal. They are those attributes which are basically, as we said, they are sifat fi'liyah ikhtiyariyah. These are attributes which Allah chooses to perform or to manifest, and they are tied to His will. They are tied to His will. They are tied to His power, His mashi'ah and His qudra. And this, the affirmation of these types of attributes, there are attributes which are tied to Allah's mashi'ah and His qudra. This is what distinguishes the people of hadith and athar, the people of the sunnah, from those various opposers, from the various sects who deviated and they rejected this category of attributes altogether. And so those groups are the Jahmiyyah, 5 groups, Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, the Kullabiyya, the Ash'ariyya and the Maturidiyya. All of these groups are agreed in rejecting this category of attribute for Allah Azza wa Jal, which is that Allah chooses to perform certain actions. Allah chooses to manifest certain attributes as and when He wills. So Imam al-Tahaawi here, he desired to affirm this category of attribute and to show that this is from the way of the Salaf, and that the Aqeedah of the Sahaba and the Imams of Islam is that they affirm the attributes of anger and pleasure in accordance with the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. Meaning upon this methodology, that we affirm these attributes, but we do not liken them to those of the creation, because there is no likeness for Allah Azza wa Jal. And so in doing this, this indicates that there is a uniform, consistent principle for affirming all of Allah's attributes, for affirming all of Allah's actions, for affirming all of Allah's names. There is just one uniform principle. What is that principle? It's explained in this ayah. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. And so therefore, when we look at all the different types of attributes, we believe that Allah speaks, we believe that Allah hears, we believe that Allah sees, we believe that Allah wills with His irada, we believe that Allah is living, has life, al-Iyaad. We believe that Allah has power, which is His qudra. We believe, in all of these attributes, and in the same way, we believe that Allah has a face that is unlike the faces of the creation. We believe that Allah has 2 hands, that He is ascended above His throne, all in a way that is unlike what we see in the creation. The realities of these attributes are different to the realities in the creation. Likewise, in a similar way, we also affirm that Allah becomes angry, He becomes pleased, that He becomes, that He loves, muhabba with muhabba. All of these things, we affirm them in using exactly the same principle for the rest of the attributes. So the point being that we only have one principle, right? There's nothing that distinguishes as to why we should accept them and why we should negate them. There isn't any. Why? Because everything is the same. That if Allah affirms an attribute for Himself, if Allah affirms an action for Himself, all of this, we treat this to be exactly the same. Why? Because Allah is the one who is informing us about Himself. He is the most truthful. And we don't make any distinction between this and between that. And this was the way of the righteous Salaf. So with this basic introduction, once we understand what At-Tahawi is intending here by way of this statement and the fact that he is affirming a specific type of attribute for Allah, which is the sifat fi'liyah, the attributes that pertain to Allah's chosen actions, then after this there are a number of masail, a number of issues which are connected to this. So the first issue is that obviously these attributes are mentioned in the Quran, they are mentioned in the Sunnah, which is why we affirm them, because this is our principle, that if Allah Azza wa Jal or His Messenger alayhi salatu wasalam establish something for Allah, mention a quality for Allah, a characteristic for Allah, a sifa, or a fi'l, an action, then we affirm that because Allah knows best about Himself. This is basically our principle for speaking about Allah. We learn about Allah by way of the revelation. This is our principle. And this differs with the people of Kalam, the people of philosophy, because they have a different principle. Their principle is that we come to know Allah by way of reason, by way of aql. This is their foundation. And we deny and we reject this foundation. It does not have any basis in the Quran nor in the Sunnah, because that which is obligatory is that we learn of Allah by way of revelation. This is what has been made wajib in the Quran, and this is how it is clearly understood by the Sahaba and the righteous Salaf. So therefore we see all of these evidences. When we see these evidences, we have iman, and we make taslim, we submit. So from those evidences is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal in Surah Al-Fath, Surah 48, verse number 18. لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ يُبَايِعُونَكَ تَحْتَ الشَّجَرَةِ. That indeed Allah became pleased, رَضِيَ اللَّهُ, became pleased with the believers when they pledged allegiance to you underneath the tree. And likewise, in many ayat in the Quran, for example in Surah Al-Bayyinah, the 98th surah, verse number 8, رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him. This occurs numerous times in the Quran. So this is pleasure. And as for anger, then Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, قُلْ هَلْ أُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِشَرٍّ مِّن ذَلِكَ مَثُوبَةً عِنْدَ اللَّهِ مَنْ لَعَنَهُ اللَّهُ وَغَضِبَ عَلَيْهِ وَجَعَلَ مِنْهُمُ الْقِرَدَةَ وَالْخَنَازِيرَ وَعَبَدَ الطَّاغُوتِ. So within this ayat, this is in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah 5, verse number 60, Allah Azza wa Jal mentions a certain group of people and how His anger, وَغَضِبَ عَلَيْهِ, that the one upon whom Allah has cursed and has become angry with. And likewise in another ayah, وَمَنْ يَقْتُلْ مُؤْمِنًا مُتَعَمِّدًا فَجَزَاؤُهُ جَهَنَّمُ خَالِدًا فِيهَا وَغَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَلَعْنَهُ. That whoever kills a believer deliberately, his recompense is hellfire remaining therein, and Allah's anger is upon him and His curse. Surah An-Nisa, Surah 4, verse number 93. And another example, وَبَاءُوا بِغَضَبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ, and that is Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah 2, verse number 61. Meaning that they earned the wrath of Allah. And another ayah, وَبَاءُوا فَبَاءُوا بِغَضَبٍ عَلَى غَضَبٍ, Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah 2, verse number 90. So all of these ayat establish the ghadab of Allah Azza wa Jal, the anger, and it's always in relation to certain things, certain actions which are displeasing to Him. As for the Sunnah, then with respect to Ar-Rida, in the hadith which mentions the reward for the people of paradise, at the end of which there occurs when Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, have I not given you? And the people will say yes. And then He will say after that, that indeed my pleasure will be upon you today, and I will not become angry with you after today ever. So here Allah will announce for the people of paradise that from this point onwards He will always be pleased with them, and His anger will never befall them ever again. So this is clear. And another hadith, Man lam yas'alillah yaghdabu alayh. The one who does not ask from Allah, the one who does not raise his hands and ask from Allah Azza wa Jal, make dua to Him, ask for Him, ask Him for things, ask Him for affairs of the religion, to increase him in iman, to increase him in knowledge, to increase him in taqwa, and so on and so forth. And likewise in the worldly affairs, to increase him, in the worldly affairs that a person asks for safety, for security, for sustenance, for wealth and things like that, which are permissible to ask, as long as they are used in obedience to Allah. Then all of these, if a person does not ask Allah, man lam yas'alillah yaghdabu alayh, Allah becomes angry with him. So there are clear evidences from the Sunnah for the attribute of pleasure and the attribute of anger. So these are clear evidences. Now again, the point being here that our way of speaking about Allah, which is faultless, it can't be faulted, is that whatever Allah affirms for Himself, we affirm it. Whatever His Messenger affirms for Him, we affirm it. Whatever Allah negates from Himself, we negate it. Whatever the Messenger negates from Allah, we negate it. This methodology cannot be criticized in any form or fashion. So we only use that speech and that language which Allah Himself has used, that the Messenger Himself has used. This is different to relying upon aql, reason, as a starting point. Because when you take, and the falsehood of this approach is very clear, that when you take all of these people who made this a foundation in their religion, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, the Kullabiyya, the Ash'ariyya, the Maturidiyya, all of them are upon this principle. They say that aql, the reason, is the foundation. But then when you see them, they all differ with each other. The Jahmi says, we cannot affirm any description for Allah. This is shirk. The Mu'tazili says, well, we can affirm the names outwardly, but we deny all the attributes. The Kullabi says, well, we can affirm the names and most of the attributes, but we deny that Allah has actions which He chooses to perform from His Mashi'ah. And then the Ash'ari comes along and he says, well, we affirm 7 attributes and we deny all of the rest, and so on and so forth. So how can, if aql is the basis, if reason is the basis, whose reason shall we trust and rely upon? Is it the reason of Jahm bin Safwan? Is it the reason of Wasil bin Ata, the head of the Mu'tazila? Is it the reason of Ibn Kullab, or Al-Ash'ari, or Maturidi? Whose reason are we following? Is it the reason of the philosophers? Whose reason? Right? So this shows that inherently is falsehood. It cannot be correct. And the correct way and the correct method is this faultless method that has been clearly explained by Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, and following the Salaf in that, which is that we speak about Allah, whatever He affirms for Himself, we affirm it, whatever He negates from Himself, we negate it, and we only use words which are used by Allah and His Messenger. We don't use any foreign, philosophically loaded words with meanings which are from outside and then they are loaded into these words. Right? All of this is misguided. So that's the first point, the first mas'ala. What are the evidences? Second mas'ala, a second issue, is that these attributes are such that they are described, that Allah is described with them whenever He wills to be angry and whenever He wills to be pleased, then it is then that He is described by these attributes. Meaning that these are not permanent attributes. Right? These are tied to His will, to His mashi'ah, to His qudra. Sometimes Allah may be angry. Sometimes Allah may be pleased with respect to an individual, a person. Right? And likewise, so in other words, these are not permanent attributes. Unlike other attributes, Allah is always seeing, Allah is always hearing. Right? So these are attributes which are tied to His will, unlike those other attributes. And in the Quran, the evidence for this is that in the Quran, in Surah Taha, Surah 20, verse number 81, Allah says, وَمَن يَحْلِلْ عَلَيْهِ غَضَبِي فَقَدْ هَوَى. That the person upon whom my anger befalls, that my anger befalls upon him, or that I become angry with him, then he has indeed gone astray. This ayah is a proof to show that anger can fall upon a person before it had not been upon a person. That Allah was pleased with a person and then Allah's anger befell a person. This is a proof to indicate it is tied to Allah's will. Now, to illustrate this, we can understand this clearly. Like we can take an example of a father, of a parent and a child, a father and a son, and a child may do something displeasing to the parents, and the parent might think about it and might decide either to be merciful or to become angry. Right? Doesn't mean that a person, to display his anger, he might choose to have patience and choose to have forbearance and not display any anger, but decide to show mercy. But what he decides to show, he has enough resolve and forbearance to think about the situation and then decide to either to become angry or decide to either to become pleased, and then to manifest that anger or to manifest that the mercy. So this is something that we can clearly understand, that if a human was able to have that type of resolve in order to choose to show anger or mercy, which we know that many humans, they do have that, and we see this exemplified in the example of the Prophet ﷺ, where amongst his enemies, many times he had he obviously he became angry for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal, but he manifested mercy, and there were many situations in which he could have resorted to acting upon his anger, but he never. He controlled it, and he showed patient resolve, and he chose to be forbearing, halim, and merciful, ra'uf, and so on and so forth. Right? So the point being that, this is something that's praiseworthy. And so, as it relates to Allah Azza wa Jal, the fact that He chooses to become angry or chooses to become pleased, right, and chooses to be forbearing, that He's Al-Halim, all of these are, this is basically a sign of perfection. This is a sign of perfection, that the fact that there are things which are tied to His will and tied to His power, that He chooses to manifest these attributes. And so that hadith is a proof that Allah can be pleased and then become angry with someone, or become angry and then be pleased with someone. Right? The fact that this can take place is evident in this hadith that we just mentioned, in this verse that we just mentioned, and likewise in the hadith that we mentioned earlier, when Allah Azza wa Jal, He says to the people of paradise, that this day will my pleasure befall you, and I will never become angry with you after this. Right? So this means that Allah Azza wa Jal, He has chosen to manifest His pleasure towards the people of paradise and never to show His anger to them after that at all. This is a proof that this is something that is chosen. It is ikhtiyari. It is tied to His will, to His mashi'ah, and His irada and His qudra. And so this is the belief of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, in that pleasure and anger, they are chosen actions of Allah Azza wa Jal. Now, as for the opposers, right? So this now becomes clear as the belief of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. As for the opposers, the people who oppose this, then, first of all, the Jahmiyyah, the Jahmites, the Jahmiyyah, whoever resembles them, they basically try to twist. They basically have a number of approaches in how to explain away these attributes, because clearly they are mentioned by Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran, and they are mentioned by the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So they have to come, they've denied them, but they have to come and explain away these attributes. So one of the ways that they explain away these attributes, this is the way of the Jahmiyyah and whoever followed them, they say that really Allah's anger is actually His punishment. It's His punishment. And Allah's pleasure is really His reward. And punishment and reward are really created things. Right? So for example, if Allah is pleased with a servant, He will bestow upon him riches and wealth and things that he enjoys and provides him safety and security. Right? So here Allah's pleasure is not an attribute that exists with Allah, but rather it's the physical created things that Allah puts in His creation around the servant, which is a reward for him. So the reward is what is Allah's pleasure. Right? Do you understand how they've basically stripped Allah of the actual attribute, and they've rendered it to be something that just exists in the creation? Right? This is the way of the Jahmiyyah. Likewise, they say that Allah's anger is simply His punishment of the servants. The fact that some servants are punished with, it could be illness, could be death, could be loss of life, as we said, death, could be loss of wealth, loss of property, could be calamities, right? So these physical occurrences, this is the anger of Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? So they've taken the attribute, they've basically explained it away and made it only something that is what we see tangibly in the creation, and that this is the anger of Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? And this is incorrect, because these things are actions performed by Allah Azza wa Jal, which themselves are tied to Allah's anger. Right? So there is an attribute of Allah Azza wa Jal, which is anger, which Allah chooses to manifest this attribute. And then there are other actions which follow, which is punishment. And so they try to explain away these two attributes in this manner. So this is the Jahmiyyah, and whoever resembled and followed them. And another approach, now that's one approach, right? They deny the attribute outright. There's no such thing as anger, there's no such thing as pleasure with Allah Azza wa Jal. Now another group, and they are the Kullabiyah. So remember, the Jahmiyyah do not affirm attributes in principle. So they had to find a way to explain away the attributes. And the approach that they took was to make every attribute simply that which is found in the creation. So for example, Allah's power, Qudra, there isn't anything which is an attribute with Allah, but rather Allah's power is just the power that we observe in the creation. For example, the power of the wind, the power of the ocean, the waves of the ocean and the power of the ocean, the power of the sun, right? All of these things are manifestations of power, right? This power, this created power, is the power of Allah Azza wa Jal, right? Do you understand how they're taking the meaning of power that we see in the creation and saying that is Allah's attribute. It is something created, right? There isn't anything which exists with Allah as an uncreated attribute that is said to be power, right? This is how the Jahmiyyah, the approach that they took, right? And they applied this to every single attribute. So therefore, every attribute of Allah Azza wa Jal is really something created. Now, a second approach, which is the approach of the Kullabiyah. This approach, by the way, is the approach of the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiyyah. And the second approach is the approach of the Kullabiyah, Ash'ariyah, Maturidiyah. Obviously, we know that in principle they do affirm the attributes, but they limit the attributes that they affirm. They do not affirm the attributes which are tied to Allah's will and His choice, like these attributes. Right? So then they had to find an approach. How can we explain away these attributes? And so basically, there was two approaches that they took. The first approach was similar to the Jahmiyyah in that they explained away the meaning of the attribute. They said, actually, one group said, well, actually Allah's anger, Allah's pleasure is simply His irada. It is simply His wish. So they return these attributes to another attribute. Right? This is one approach that was taken by them. That they simply interpreted these attributes that are problematic to them, and they referred them back to one attribute that they actually do affirm. So the Ash'aris and Maturidis, they affirm the attribute of irada, that Allah has a wish. And they said anger is just Allah's irada. Pleasure is just Allah's irada, something that Allah desires. Right? This is one approach. The second approach that they took, the other approach, is that they said, well, hang on, we don't believe that Allah is subject to, changing His state. Right? This does not befit Allah. Right? Allah is only eternal. His attributes are only eternal. So what they said was that Allah's anger and pleasure are eternal. They are not tied to His will and His choice. So for example, if a person was to die upon disbelief, if a person was to die as a kafir, even though he was a believer before that, then in eternity Allah was only ever angry with him. Right? So Allah's anger and Allah's pleasure is only tied to the outcome of an individual. Right? But as for if and when he was righteous and pious, Allah was never pleased with him at any time whatsoever. Why? Because the affairs are tied firstly to this attribute being eternal, and secondly to the end situation that a person dies upon. Right? What are they trying to do here? What they're trying to do is they're trying to avoid affirming these attributes being tied to Allah's will and Allah's choice. Such, for example, that Allah was displeased with a disbeliever, with a kafir, because he was a mushrik, for example, and committing all sorts of other sins. Right? So they're saying, so what they're trying to deny is that Allah was displeased with his actions. Then when that person became a Muslim and became righteous, then Allah became pleased with him. They're trying to deny this, which is indicated in the Quran and the Sunnah. Why? Because as we mentioned before, that they were following a philosophical approach to proving Allah's existence, and that philosophical approach demanded from them that Allah, how they saw it, that Allah cannot be subject to change. Allah cannot change. Right? He is eternal and never undergoes change. This is really a philosophical concept that they took from people like Aristotle. Right? That they tried to prove Allah's existence using a corrupt proof, and that proof demanded from them to speak about Allah in this way. Allah is never subject to change. Right? And they, came from a faulty angle. But as for what we find in the Quran and the Sunnah, the fact that Allah can choose to be angry and choose to be pleased and choose to love someone and choose to dislike someone, all of this choice and mashi'a and ikhtiyar, all of this is from perfection. We see this as perfection. They see it as something that would make Allah to be like the rest of the creatures, subject to change. This is really a philosophical poison that they brought into the field of Aqeedah. Right? And so on that basis, they basically try to say, well, hold on, anger and pleasure are really, there's no element of choice tied to them. Rather, Allah is angry in eternity with the one who would enter hellfire, with the one who would die upon disbelief and sin. And Allah was pleased in eternity with the one whom He knew would enter into paradise. So in other words, Allah's anger and pleasure have got no connection to the action of the servant. It's got no connection to the actions performed by the people. So, a person could be a mushrik, worshipper of idols for all of his life, and at the end of his life, he becomes a Muslim. And according to them, Allah was only ever pleased with him from eternity. Allah never became angry with him at the time that he was committing shirk, killing people, murdering people, fornicating, committing adultery, stealing, cheating, robbing. Allah was never angry with him whatsoever, not even for a single moment, for any of these actions that he was doing. Right? Why? Because Allah knew in eternity he would enter paradise, and so eternally Allah has only ever been pleased with him and nothing else. And the reason why they're saying this is that they want to remove the element of choice away from Allah Azza wa Jal, from his, and to avoid affirming actions for him because of their corrupt philosophical idea that they brought into Islam from outside. So obviously that's very clear. And so the result of this, basically this innovated approach, is two things. Number one, first of all, they are clearly rejecting the attribute. This is a clear denial that Allah becomes angry and becomes pleased. As At-Tahaawiyyah said, Wallahu yaghdabu wa yarda, la ka ahadin min al-wara. And secondly, basically, it means that really there is no meaning to what was said earlier on about Allah becoming angry with his servants or becoming pleased with his servants and forgiving his servants, and all of those different things that we find in the Quran. There's no all of that meaning. There's no meaning to all of that. All of that is lost, right? So, it's as if a person from the greatest of the disbelievers and mushriks committing the greatest of evil. Now, we cannot say about this person that this person is hated and disliked by Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? All of this is now removed because we don't know what he's going to end upon. Right? He may end up as a believer. And so therefore we refrain from saying anything about him, that what the shirk that he's upon is kufr, is disbelief, that it is shirk. That all these activities that he is doing, they are evil activities. We can't say that anymore. And when we can't say that anymore, and we can't tie these to Allah's anger and Allah's pleasure, then this now means that we are undermining, we are breaking the handholds of Islam, of Iman. And, so all of this, as you can see, it kind of really undermines the attributes of Allah Azza wa Jal. It undermines these affairs. So, this is the view of the Kullabiyah and the Ash'ariyah and the Maturidiyah, that these attributes are eternal. They are not tied to Allah's will. They are not tied to Allah's choice. Right? They existed with Allah from eternity. So, in eternity, Allah was angry with this group of people. In eternity, Allah was pleased with this group of people because of his knowledge that this group would enter paradise and this group would enter hellfire. And this does not have any basis in the Quran or the Sunnah. Rather, it is clearly and explicitly rejected by the Quran because of the clear, explicit evidences that we've seen. The hadith in which the people of paradise will be told that from this day onwards, it will only be my pleasure, anger will never befall you ever again. And also, in fact, there's another hadith which is a famous proof in this regard. The hadith in which Allah Azza wa Jal, where it is mentioned that Allah Azza wa Jal on Yawm al-Qiyamah, he will become angry with an anger with which he has never become angry before that. This is an authentic hadith, right? This clearly shows that anger is something that is tied to Allah's will and tied to Allah's irada, Allah's mashiyah. So this is the second mas'ala, and what we'll do, inshallah ta'ala, we'll conclude with that there, and we'll finish off this discussion. There's more to this discussion yet in relation to the attributes and the approach of the Jahmiyyah. And what we'll do, we'll cover that, inshallah ta'ala, in the following lesson. We'll conclude for this lesson today, inshallah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.